We have an awesome guest today, somebody I'm really excited to speak with. I've had a lot of interactions with our company and so have my clients. His name is Brannon, and he deals a lot with like private equity purchases versus DSO purchases and the deals and EBITDA and multiples and all this stuff we hear about every day in the chat groups. And our friends say, my friend got a 10x EBITDA and all this craziness, but what does it really mean? So we're going to start with Brannon. Because first, real quick, tell us about your company and stuff. But really, like if I was a family member or a friend and I owned a dental practice or a group, I had a chance to interact with you at a barbecue. And I was like, hey, man, I'm thinking about selling. I hear all these keywords, private equity versus DSO purchase. What would be the words of advice you would give me or the first information you would give me to kind of give me an idea of understanding this stuff better?
Great question. Good to see you guys, Matt and Andrew. Thanks for having me on. So my name is Brannon Moncrief, Principal CEO of McLerran Associates. My firm's been around 35 years. I've been in dental 23 years and owned McLerran for the past 13. We specialize in doing sell-side advisory for dental practice owners. Whether you're a small kind of mom and pop practice looking to go the more traditional private practice sale route where you sell to another clinician, we've got a team that handles those types of transactions. And then I lead our DSO and private equity team. So doing sell-side advisory for large practice owners that are looking to monetize their business, whether that's through a DSO affiliation or partnering directly with private equity. So yeah, this is the sandbox that I play in, day out. The first thing I tell practice owners is get educated about your options, right? There's so much misinformation out there. Understand all the keywords, EBITDA, DSOs, private equity. Does it make sense? Given your goals, given your why, given the size of your practice to even think about going down that road. And if so, when's the appropriate time to pull the trigger, on a potential sale. But if we're talking about today, mainly DSO, private equity transactions, most DSOs are backed by some type of institutional capital, whether it be private equity or a family office. So if you have a large practice and you're looking to monetize it, if you're, let's say, 2 million EBITDA plus, that's a very large multi-site practice, likely, revenue 8 million plus, you'll have the option to sell to what we call a strategic buyer, another DSO that's already established, has infrastructure, has a defined culture and deal structure, or sell to private equity. And in that situation, you're the platform investment. You're the private equity firm's launch pad to start a DSO. So two very different options. And when it comes to valuation, we often say strategic buyers will bid a lower EBITDA multiple on a lower EBITDA multiple on a higher EBITDA figure because they already have the infrastructure. They already have the components that they need to scale the business, while private equity is using you and your infrastructure as a launch pad for growth. And therefore, they will bid a higher EBITDA multiple on a lower EBITDA figure. But the reality is, when it comes to valuation is fairly congruent, whether you're looking to sell to private equity or affiliate with the DSO. So everybody wants to talk about multiples, but we got to talk about a multiple of what, right? Your EBITDA drives the value far more than the multiple. So what you really got to talk about first is what is the EBITDA figure they're bidding off of, and then apply a multiple to that figure. And that EBITDA figure could vary depending on the type of buyer at the table.
That's great, Brand. I think a lot of really good stuff to unpack here. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, basically what you're saying is you reach a certain point, you reach a certain size of top line revenue of EBITDA. It's very difficult to sell to a private dentist. It's very difficult for them to get a loan from the bank to buy your practice. So at that point, you kind of have two options. And option one is private equity. And option two is to sell to a DSO. And if you're selling to private equity, they are basically investing in you. They are, putting their money up because they feel like you've built some good systems and they can kind of take off from there and continue to grow. Whereas if you sell to a DSO, they're basically just kind of bringing you into their operation that's already into existence. And so they may offer a lower multiple because they already have those systems. They don't need your system set up and things like that. Is that more or less what you're saying there?
Yeah, that's correct. So private equity is going to need all of your infrastructure, all of your systems. You're right. They're betting on you. That's going to be a long-term commitment where you're kind of going to be the man, moving forward. That's going to, drive the growth of the business. And because they need all your infrastructure to stay intact, infrastructure costs money, right? It erodes EBITDA. They're going to bid a higher multiple on a lower EBITDA figure comparative to a DSO that really doesn't need to inherit your infrastructure or build infrastructure around you. They already have it. So they're going to bid typically a lower multiple on a higher EBITDA figure. But I want to go back to a comment that you said, because, when does it get compelling to look at, a DSO or private equity sale comparative to a private buyer, more traditional practice sale where you're selling to another clinician? And the demarcation point typically is around about $2 million in revenue, around $400,000 to $500,000 in EBITDA. That's where there's less demand and lower valuations from a private buyer perspective. And that's where the value of the business from a DSO perspective starts to run away from the private buyer valuation, very quickly. So if you could find a private buyer to buy that $2 million top line revenue practice with $500,000 in EBITDA, on a good day, they might pay 1.6, 1.8 million for that practice. Whereas a DSO buyer is going to look at it through the lens of a multiple of EBITDA, $500,000 in EBITDA, 7x multiple, you're talking about a $3.5 million valuation, double what a private buyer would pay. And when the numbers get bigger, when you start talking about $1 million in EBITDA, $1.5 million, $2 million in EBITDA, that delta grows significantly. Far higher valuation in the DSO private equity world, far more demand, far lower valuation, lower demand in the more traditional private practice sales space.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And so like in a private practice sale, typically things are pretty consistent and they're more focused on a percentage of revenue. I mean, for whatever reason, that's what they picked, whether it's 80% or whatever. But the crazy part, guys, is that you could have $1 million practice that has $100,000 in EBITDA or 10% EBITDA margin, or you could have $1 million practice that has 30% EBITDA with 300,000, and you're going to get fairly similar valuations selling to a private dentist. So like, that's the sad part. It's like, they're not as concerned about the profit of the business. They're just looking at what your collections were last year. Whereas they should be, but in a lot of cases they're not.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, when you're selling to private equity or to a DSO, they don't really care at all what the top line revenue is. They really only care about what the profit is, which is really what it should be. That's how a business should be valued, is on the profit. And let's talk about EBITDA for a second, because there are a lot of our listeners that may not know exactly what EBITDA is. Just give like a very simple explanation to our listeners about what EBITDA truly means.
Yeah. And going back to what I said a little bit earlier, EBITDA is the number one driver of value in the DSO private equity space. And it's amazing how much EBITDA gets manipulated and how often it's, miscalculated. If you give your numbers to 5 different DSOs, 5 different CPAs, you're probably going to get 10 different EBITDA figures back. And in a lot of ways, DSOs, private equity is relatively predatory in the sense that their goal is to buy low and sell high. The number one way they take advantage of dentists is convince them that their EBITDA is lower than it actually is, dangle the carrot of a sexy multiple, but they're actually undercutting value because your EBITDA is significantly higher. Think of EBITDA as absentee owner profit, right? So revenue minus real overhead expenses after eliminating any non-recurring personal discretionary expenses, minus doctor compensation, including paying the owner to their percentage of their chairside collections. And oftentimes that's where people screw up when they look at EBITDA. I'll have people call me and say, hey, Brannon, my practice top line revenue, 1.2 million, and my EBITDA is 400,000. And I'm like, wait, time out. Did you pay yourself to do the dentistry you're doing? Oh, no, I didn't pay myself. Yes, you've got to take out a market wage for the doctors to do the dentistry, and understanding that your compensation as the owner, if you're working chairside, is likely going to be congruent to whatever compensation structure you have with your associates at the time you sell. So if you're paying your associates 30% of their chairside collections, you're likely going to be compensated 30% of your chairside collections. If it's 35%, expect to get 35%. Just understand that Dr. Comp erodes EBITDA. So if you're really generous with your associates, DSOs are going to assume that's market in your geography. they're going to pay you the same way, and it could impact your EBITDA pretty substantially.
Yeah. So, the doc's thinking that they can kind of outsmart the system. These DSOs, these private equities, they're just going to make adjustments to the EBITDA. So if you try to be like, oh, I only pay myself 15% of production, or whatever it is, they're going to add that back and subtract it from your EBITDA. So there's really no way to kind of cheat the system. Everything's going to be normalized, to some extent whenever they're making those calculations.
Yeah. You just want to make sure you have an advisor like us controlling that narrative. Yeah. You don't want the buyer telling you what your EBITDA is. That's the last thing, you want.
So I think, one of the things that makes dentists hesitant to sell to DSOs or to private equity is the fear that they're going to have to stay in the practice, long term. And I hear different ranges thrown around, and I think it does vary by the DSO or by the private equity, whoever's, making that offer. And if you get 5 offers, they may all want different time commitments and different amounts of commitment. Let me ask you this, as you're approaching, getting ready to maybe make a sale to a DSO or private equity, would it be beneficial for the owner to start slowly stepping back more and more chair side? So like, let's say you go into the sale and for the last 18 months or 24 months, you haven't been chair side at all, or you've only been chair side half a day a week. Is that going to come into play with what the DSO or the private equity is going to expect from you once you make the sale?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. I mean, in all of these transactions, there's going to be some type of post-closing commitment. And it used to be 2 to 3 years. DSOs have gotten wise to the fact that doctor turnover, in particular founder turnover, leads to lower performance. So they're trying to lock doctors in for longer-term commitments. So it's moved more towards a 3 to 5 year commitment, 5 years in most cases, but it does come with more autonomy than it did previously. You actually don't have to work chair side at all. They just want to know that you're vested in the business long term. DSOs are sensitive to key man risks, so the more you can, bifurcate production between multiple providers, the better. So if you do step back clinically and or from a management perspective and you play a limited role in your business, you're probably going to have more flexibility when you go to sell regarding what your post-closing commitment is going to look like, the length of it, as well as your involvement. That said, most DSOs are going to want you still to have a vested interest in the business ongoing for 3 to 5 years, irregardless of how much you're involved in the business or a little you're involved in the business at sale. And it's been interesting. I mean, we just took a deal to market in California where my client, 5 million top line revenue practice, 4-doctor practice. My client has not worked chairside in 20 years. And he has a very, very strong office manager, and he doesn't do much, in the practice on a daily basis. And we expected that DSOs would absolutely love that. Yeah. It's like a perfect plug and play for a DSO. My client steps out, they step in, they manage the business moving forward. And it's going to trade, and it's going to trade at a good multiple. Well, we've been a little bit surprised about how hesitant DSOs were to bid on that opportunity. And I think that speaks to the fact that most DSOs, the types of DSOs that we work with, this DSO version 2.0 or 3.0, whatever you want to call it, they're not super hands-on operationally. So they really want someone, if not multiple people, vested at the practice level so that on the day-to-day, there's somebody that cares about the ongoing performance of the business.
No, I think that makes sense. What about from the perspective of like building out your leadership team? Like let's say you kind of step back chairside and, you grow and maybe you're a group of 10 practices. And so now you've got an operations manager, a regional manager, maybe you're the CEO or even you have an outside CEO come in. Is that something that, these DSOs are looking for? Is that something that makes the group more attractive to them?
So if you go down that path of building infrastructure, building out a C-suite, understand that you are positioning your business to be sold to private equity, not necessarily a strategic buyer, another DSO. If you do look to sell to a strategic, they don't need those C-level execs. So they're going to probably remove all of your infrastructure because those are duplicative positions, right? They already have a CFO, a COO, a controller, what have you. So if you're going to make that investment in that infrastructure, in that C-suite, one, understand that that's a long-term move, right? Because when you build that infrastructure, when you build out that C-suite, it's a substantial investment that is going to erode EBITDA. And you're going to need to grow substantially to offset that investment just to get back to level with where you were from a valuation perspective before you built out that infrastructure. So we're big about inflection points. And once you get to the point where it starts to make sense to centralize infrastructure, if you've got 3, 4, 5, 7 locations, and then when you get to 10 and you start to look at building out that C-suite, at each iteration, I think it's smart to pop your head up and go, okay, what's my short-term goals? What are my long-term goals? Does it make sense for me to pursue a partner now and maybe leverage their infrastructure and their capital to grow? Or am I going to do this on my own, put my head down and know that I've got to grow substantially to offset that investment and then maybe look to monetize the business? Unfortunately, oftentimes what we see is people hit that inflection point. They don't pop their head up. They invest in that infrastructure. They try to build out a C-suite. Operational talent, by the way, I'm sure, as you know, Andrew, hardest positions to fill in a dental practice. They're expensive, and a lot of them aren't as effective as they may portray themselves to be in the interview process. Yep. And a lot of people will say, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to get to 15, 20 locations. Then I'm going to look to monetize the business. They make those investments. They build the infrastructure. They build out the C-suite, and then the performance isn't there. And mid-stride, they're like, all right, this is too much work. I was making more money with less headaches with 5 locations than I was with 10. Now I want to pivot and sell mid-stride. Now we got to figure out, right? Do we tear apart the infrastructure? How do we represent this opportunity when we go to market? It's going to be a lot messier than it would have been had you looked to monetize it before you made that leap.
Sounds like maybe the key is to add infrastructure slowly. So, to not get that point where you're like, you know what, I'm going to build out our infrastructure so I can add 10 more practices in the next year. And all of a sudden you add an internal call center, an internal insurance team, you add, 5 executives and all this stuff, because to your point, that's going to seriously erode your EBITDA. And now you're hurrying up to try to add all these practices to catch up with, your infrastructure, versus like, all right, you know what, we're going to keep adding practices, and like, I'm going to add 1 executive member, or we're going to add 1 portion of our infrastructure, this year or whatever it is. And I think you're right too, in that you've got to stop and think about what your actual goals are, rather than just, flying by the seat of your pants. Otherwise, you might end up in a situation, where you're trying to backtrack at that point. So.
Yeah. And I mean, understand also that, life happens, right? We've got a personal side of our lives that is ever changing. So oftentimes when people decide to pivot and sell, it's not because of anything that happened in the business, because something happened, in life. So I think just, being mindful of inflection points and making sure that you build your practice, your business intentionally, and scale it intentionally. Look, it's no different than the new grad dental student that I talked to that calls about buying one of our private practice opportunities and says, hey, this is who I am. I'm going to own 25 practices. I'm like, man, I hope you do. I would love to sell you 25 offices, but let's do this. Buy 1, try not to F it up, and then let's talk about number 2.
Yeah. Yep. No, that makes perfect sense, man. So let's talk about what are some of the things that really make a group attractive to a DSO or private equity. I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit. Is there a sweet spot for EBITDA? Is there a point where EBITDA actually becomes too high and it starts to decrease multiples and decrease value? What other things is the EBITDA percentage, the margin, is that something that's attractive? Are things like your systems, your Google reviews, your reputation in the community, your branding, are those things that make you more attractive? Like, what can our listeners really focus on that can add more value to their group other than just their, EBITDA number?
Love this question. EBITDA level is the number one driver of value. At a minimum, let's say $500,000 in EBITDA, but there is a maximum where you start to have diminishing returns, and that's around $5 million in EBITDA. The sweet spot is between $1 million in EBITDA and $5 million in EBITDA. And once you cross about $2 to $2.5 million in EBITDA, if you're multi-site and you're in an attractive geography, that's where you have the broadest buyer market, because that's where strategic buyers, existing DSOs are absolutely going to be interested, but that's where private equity starts to get very interested in utilizing you as a platform to start a DSO and scale. So a lot of our clients are in that, $1 million to $2 million EBITDA range. A lot of demand there, but mainly from strategic buyers, existing DSOs. When you cross that $2 million EBITDA dollar mark, that's where private equity comes into play. But once you get to about $5 million in EBITDA, that's where the strategics start to back away. And that's where you really limit yourself to only selling to private equity. And honestly, that's where we've seen the most compression in demand over the past 18 months because of how tight the capital markets have been and because of rising interest rates. It takes a lot of debt to get a $5 million EBITDA deal done, right? That deal's probably going to trade at 10x. $50 million deal might require, $30 to $40 million in debt. It's harder to get access to that debt right now. So you've seen less demand and more compression in the multiples and valuations over $5 million in EBITDA over the past 18 months. That's expected to loosen up a little bit over the next 18 months, but I prefer that you're somewhere in that, million to 5 million range. That's where you're going to have the most optionality. So what impacts the valuation outside of the EBITDA level? I mean, number of locations. However, you need to understand that more locations come with more overhead, right? More staff, more occupancy costs. So it erodes EBITDA. I'd much rather work with somebody with $10 million in top line revenue and 3 locations than $10 million in top line revenue with 7 locations, right? I know that the EBITDA on the practice with 3 locations is going to be significantly higher and the margin is going to be higher than that 7 location practice. The EBITDA margin does play a role in it. I mean, healthy EBITDA margin somewhere in the 20 to 25% range. If you're running at significantly lower margins, that shows that you might be inefficient and have some systems issues. If you're running super hot, right, EBITDA margins 30% plus, is that sustainable long term? So you might trade for a little bit lower multiple if your EBITDA margins, through the roof, because there's not a lot of meat on the bone, right? There's not a lot of fat for a buyer to cut and buy down the multiple that they pay. So they look at that to some degree. Bifurcation of key man risk. Do you have youth in the office? Is the production split between multiple providers? You will see practices trade for higher multiples with more bidders if the owner or owners are under the age of 50, comparative to closer to the tail end of their career. There's certainly different geographies where you have more demand than others. That's starting to fade away a little bit because the consolidation is really happening across the country at this point. West Coast has, less buyers than East Coast. Arizona, Texas, and the Southeast have been hotbeds for DSO activity for a long time. You have more bidders, more competition, typically higher multiples. Patient mix to some degree, comes into play. Private equity hates regulation. They hate oversight, and Medicaid comes with a lot of regulation.
Yeah,
Obviously,
I avoid Medicaid.
Yep. Obviously, if you're talking about pedo, there's going to be a Medicaid component. But if you get over 50% Medicaid, it's going to limit demand and it's going to, play with the multiple a bit in an adverse way. So reputation, you mentioned Google reviews. Absolutely. I love, Googling a client before I get on the phone with them for a discovery call and seeing that they have, 800 5-star Google reviews. That moves the needle. So all of those things collectively will impact demand, the multiple, and the ultimate valuation.
You said something interesting there, Brandon. And so there's a big debate in dental about, do I go rural or do I go to, the city? Do I go where I want to live, or do I go rural because it's easier to make money there? I made the decision to go to a city, Tampa, partially because that's where my wife and I wanted to live. But, my other thought process was I kind of always had the idea that I may want multiple practices. I knew I wanted to work with other dentists. I didn't want to be a solo practitioner. And in my mind, I thought it would be a lot easier to find team members, to find dentists, if I was in a more urban location than if I went somewhere rural. And that's definitely been true. Now, there is, on the flip side, there is more competition. So there are, tons of dentists in the area. you have to do more to differentiate yourself. You probably have to spend more on marketing. You very well may have to take on more insurances, at least the PPO insurances, versus if you went somewhere rural. But does that also come into play in valuations? Let's say you have a rural group versus an urban group. Are you getting a higher valuation on one of those? Is one more sought after by private equity and DSOs, or does that not really matter?
Yeah, so that's where we start to talk about EBITDA versus multiples, right? So you're going to trade likely for a higher multiple and have more demand if you're in an urban or suburban area versus a rural environment. But you're likely going to have better margins and a higher EBITDA in a rural market. So you might trade for a lower multiple because there's less demand in that rural market, but that multiple is being applied to maybe a much higher EBITDA figure comparative to the practice that's in the urban suburban market. So they both matter, right? The EBITDA itself matters tremendously. Every dollar in EBITDA is worth $7 to $10 in value. And then the multiple and demand matters. So those equations kind of balance out to some degree. But I will say, if you're super rural, like we just took a practice to market in rural, I won't name the state because it might trigger who the client is, but Midwest, rural area, and the demand was not there, even though it was a great business. $2 million in EBITDA, multiple locations. My client was young. We got 3 solid offers, but I typically like that 5, 7, 10 offers. So it traded for a little bit lower multiple than we were hoping for. There was demand, but it just wasn't near the demand had that practice been located in a more urban or suburban market in that same state.
That's interesting for sure. And good for, again, a lot of our listeners are, aspiring practice owners. They're looking to buy or do their first startup. And so this is all good stuff to think about, guys. I mean, honestly, my advice, especially if you're looking for the long haul, you want to be a practice owner for the next 20, 30 years, I think you should go and live where you and your family are going to be happiest, because I truly believe you can be successful anywhere if you differentiate yourself, if you create a good patient experience, if you invest in marketing. So I think that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind. But these are things to keep in mind too. If you are looking to build a group and potentially sell it, but before you're 60, it may make more sense to go somewhere urban, suburban, and you may have more trouble if you go very rural trying to sell your practice, trying to sell your group. What about spread? Let's talk about that. So, is it more advantageous to have let's say you've got 5 locations? Are you better off having those 5 locations in a smaller radius, let's say 20-mile radius around a city, or are you better off spreading those out a little bit further so they don't cannibalize each other? Does it really matter to the DSO private equity buyers?
Well, if I was building a group, I would want to be able to drive to each of my offices from my house in the same day, right? I think just the threat of mom or dad showing up and peeking their head in alone is going to make the practices likely perform better as an owner. From a buyer's standpoint, geographic density is a good thing. So you definitely want all of your practices, I would say, within a 60-mile radius. You don't want them too tight because you don't want to cannibalize your own business, right? You don't want to compete with yourself. But I see these groups occasionally where they'll call on this, like, I've got 3 practices in this state and I've got 5 practices in this state. And I'm like, sometimes they're multiple states away. And I'm like, that's a bad idea, because most DSOs, they love geographic density. And many DSOs are regionally based, right? So if you want maximum demand, you want to have density. Otherwise, if you've got practices located in different states that are hundreds of miles apart, you're really limiting your buyer pool to a nationwide buyer, as opposed to broadening your buyer pool to not only nationwide buyers, but regional buyers as well. And private equity in particular, they want density because they're likely going to establish an HQ where you're at. And if you don't have any density, it's just very, very hard to wrap their arms around, how are they going to fill in the gaps along the way?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. So let's switch gears here for a second, Brent. Let's play a fun little hypothetical game. Let's say that I'm coming to you as a client, and currently I've got this group. We've got 4 practices. We're projecting about 9.5 this year, although I'm hoping we're going to hit 10 in top line. And we're projecting our EBITDA right around 2.5. So we're looking a little bit above 25% EBITDA. I think we're running 26, 27% right now. What does the process look like as far as, taking my group to market? What steps are we going through? And what type of multiples, valuations are you giving me as estimates of like, hey, I think we could get you this type of multiple or this type of estimate for your group?
So obviously very healthy numbers there. I love that. If you've got an average revenue per location of 2 million plus, that's fantastic. EBITDA margin 25%, you're in a fantastic geography. So you would have a tremendous amount of optionality and demand. You would be a fit for strategic buyers as well as being a fit for a platform for private equity. First step that we typically do is to do our own EBIT analysis, do our own deep dive, get to know the business intimately. That's where we can do some modeling as far as, economic implications of a sale under certain deal structures. So we would pinpoint your EBITDA and then plug that into different models. If you did a private equity deal at 80-20, 80% cash, 20%, platform level equity, and you hit a recap in 5 years at a 5x return on equity, versus selling to a strategic at a 60-40 joint venture model, what would that look like based on certain assumptions? So we do a lot of economic modeling to figure out, is now the right time, to pull the trigger on going to market. I would expect a group like that would trade to a strategic somewhere in the range of 8 to 9 times EBITDA. And if you sold to private equity, somewhere in the range of 9 to probably 11 times EBITDA on the high end. And again, we'd have to talk about what does EBITDA look like in both of those scenarios. So I would venture to say that if your EBITDA margin is at 25% with 4 locations, you likely have limited, centralized infrastructure and haven't built out a C-suite. That's how you're able to maintain those margins, which is wise at 4 locations. Therefore, if you're selling to a strategic, they're going to bid based on your current EBITDA level. But if you're selling to private equity is going to say, hey, Andrew, you haven't built the infrastructure. You don't have the C-suite. We're going to have to build infrastructure around you in order to scale you. So they may layer in some infrastructural costs to erode your EBITDA. Again, so they might be bidding 10 times EBITDA, but it's on a lower figure because they've got to layer in infrastructure to utilize your business as the platform and scale it from there. Versus strategic already has the infrastructure. They can bid on your EBITDA as it currently sits, but they'll bid a lower multiple. In the end, the valuations, might be somewhat congruent around 16 to 20 million, somewhere in that range. Here's what's key though. When we take an opportunity to market, we're going to have a private conversation behind the veil about your EBITDA and where we think the practice will trade. But we utilize what we call a blind bid process when we take it to market. We don't price the practice. We have a private conversation about valuation just to make sure that our expectations are somewhat aligned before we go to market. If you said, hey, Brandon, I want 50 million for my business, I'd say, let's not waste each other's time. Here's what you need to do to reverse engineer that goal if that's what you want. But assuming we're on the same page and we give you a range and, give you some economic implications, and it's like, all right, this looks good. This makes sense for me. We take it to market utilizing a blind bid process. So we essentially create a bidding war among as many buyers as we possibly can, with the sole goal of creating maximum optionality, as many bids as possible, finding the right buyer for your business, and then leveraging that competition to negotiate the most favorable valuation as well as structure that we can. And fit and structure are equally, if not more important than valuation. A lot of people get caught up on the EBITDA multiple or the valuation. That stuff's certainly important, but you're going to have a substantial equity component in all of these deals. And the second bite of the apple at recap could be as significant as the initial cash at close. So picking the right partner with the right equity structure, depending on your why, depending on how your business is engineered and what your short-term and long-term goals are, that's as important or more important than the initial valuation.
Yeah, and so for our audience with the second bite of the apple, basically what you're saying is that whenever you sell in most of these deals, you're getting a certain amount of cash up front, but then you're leaving some of that on the table and you're actually reinvesting into the DSO that's buying you. And
That's
so
correct.
when they do their next recap based on that performance, you're going to get hopefully some sort of multiple on that money that you left on the table. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's going to depend on, likely practice level performance and then platform performance, how the DSO as a whole performed. And you've got to think about, how large is the DSO that you're partnering with, right? The larger the DSO, the less risk, but the lower return likely on the equity at recap versus betting on a smaller emerging DSO that's going to have more risk of potential failure or loss, but typically a higher return and a higher propensity to hit multiple recaps. So as DSOs grow in size, the return on equity goes down and the recap cycles tend to extend because they've got to grow exponentially to create arbitrage. Whereas smaller DSOs can generate more growth, comparatively speaking, in a shorter window and have the propensity to hit multiple recaps and see that compounding impact on the equity performance.
What type of time range are we usually seeing on these recaps? And I guess it can vary, as you were saying, based on the size of the DSO and everything, but how often are these recaps typically happening?
3 to 5 years has historically been the goal, but that was before macroeconomic conditions changed. I think recap cycles moving forward will be more like, 5 to 7 years in order to generate the type of, return on cash that private equity is looking to generate. And then as DSOs get larger, Heartland, for example, owned by KKR, one of the largest private equity firms in the world, their only buyer likely moving forward is an IPO. So they're more of in like a 15-year, holding pattern with good returns, but, modest returns, comparatively speaking, to private equity's goal. And, private equity that utilizes that buy and build strategy, their goal typically, at least historically, has been a 1x return on every year of the recap cycle. So a 400 to 500% return on invested cash in a 5-year recap cycle. With the current macroeconomic environment, the capital markets being tight, interest rates being elevated, you're probably talking more like, 0.5 to 0.75x return on each year of the recap cycle. So whereas the goal used to be the, 4 to 5x return, maybe now it's 2 to 4x return on a recap cycle.
So whenever you're making these sales, you are selling 100% of your business. You are getting a certain percentage, let's call it 60% of cash up front, and that other 40% is going into that DSO. But you're not retaining any ownership of your actual business. It's going into the DSO for that next recap. Is that correct?
It depends. Not necessarily. So that's the traditional private equity model, is that they're going to buy 100% of your practice. They're going to own 100% of your EBITDA. You're going to take 60 to 80% cash at close off the table and then trade the remaining value of your business for stock in the DSO's parent company.
Okay.
The pro there is that, look, if they do well, the return on that stock could be substantial. The big negative there is that you give up all the EBITDA in your business. Because dentistry is so provider centric and DSOs understand that provider turnover, in particular founder turnover, is their Achilles heel, there's been a move in dentistry and the private equity world towards more of a joint venture model so that you have alignment at the practice level. So we're seeing a lot more joint venture deals or what we call hybrid deal structures, whereby you're going to have a cash at close component, likely somewhere in the 60 to 70% range. And then there's going to be some element of joint venture equity. That's practice level equity, retained equity in your own business, so that you are vested in the ongoing performance of your individual business, not just the whole of the DSO. And in a joint venture structure, a pure joint venture structure, it's cash and then retained equity at the practice level. And then at recap, you have the opportunity to liquidate a portion of your practice level equity predicated upon your practice level EBITDA times the EBITDA multiple that the parent company is trading for. The other type of deal structure, that hybrid structure, is where the equity component is bifurcated in between joint venture equity. So part of the equity is practice level equity, and then part of the equity is actually stock in that parent company DSO. So there's been a big move towards joint venture equity more recently because you want alignment of incentives. And if you don't own equity at the practice level, you could have a free rider problem where, if I sell 100% of my business, I no longer own equity in my own practice. I'm just, one fish in, the ocean of that DSO. I might say, the return on my equity doesn't really depend on me continuing to keep my foot on the gas. I'll pull back counting on the fact that all of the other practices in the DSO are going to work hard and therefore protect the value of my equity. Well, if every practice owner thought like that, the value of the equity is going to suck when you get to a recap. So DSOs have gotten wise that they need to incentivize doctors at the local level. The way to do that is for them to have some sort of joint venture equity in their own practice.
And this model, this is like that MB2 model. For those that I've heard of that.
MB2 kind of pioneered the joint venture model in the DSO space. Now we have quite a few smaller DSOs that are emulating MB2 to some degree.
Interesting. So obviously a lot of different things to consider. This is why you want an expert on your side, and you would never want to go about it yourself trying to take the first deal that comes at you, because obviously they're gonna look at you as a sucker and they're gonna give you a sucker's deal. So you guys, if you're building a group, I mean, honestly, if you have any practice to sell, you should have an expert on your team. But if you're building a group and you hear all the different options for sale, all the different ways EBITDA are calculated, all the different multiples that could happen, the different requirements they may have of you as the founder, and how long you've got to stay on and what that means, it's really important that, your practice gets looked at by as many potential buyers as possible, and that you've got someone that can help you decipher what the different offers actually mean. Let me ask you this. Let's say that you do sell in a traditional sale. So, you're not retaining any ownership of your actual practice. Let's say you're not practicing clinically and you are essentially in the role of CEO of your business. They're going to expect you to stay on for a certain period of time. Are they going to offer you some kind of salary to continue to run that organization, or how does that work?
That's a fantastic question. So if you are in that role as a CEO, no longer working chairside, then we've got to talk about what is your ongoing role going to be in the business and how are you going to be compensated? Yep. And how does that compensation impact EBITDA, right? Because if you want to take a $300,000 wage on a go-forward basis, that $300,000 is coming out of your EBITDA. If we're talking about a 9x multiple, that's $2.7 million off the valuation of the business. So we've got to really unpack, like, what's your current role in the business? What's going to be your post-sale role in the business? And how are you going to be compensated? The DSO is going to want you to be compensated, right? To keep you incentivized. Again, alignment of incentives. Because if you're not compensated, then you may not come to work. So again, that's where that joint venture model comes into play, where you don't necessarily have to take compensation as a CEO if you still have a meaningful equity position at the practice level. But if you are going to sell out in a holding company structure where you're not holding any practice level equity and you're going to remain on as the CEO, we've got to solve for how you're going to be comped and how is that going to impact the EBITDA and the valuation at time of initial sale.
Let's say you were making that $300. Let's say you were paying yourself as a CEO that $300,000 salary, and then you sell to a DSO who doesn't really need you there as quote unquote CEO, but they still want you involved. And you say, you know what, I don't need this $300,000 salary. Is that then going to be added back to your EBITDA?
Potentially, yes. Yeah. If that's what we want that value, right? We want to apply that multiplier to that EBITDA. Then yes, potentially. It just depends on how intimately involved you are in the business, up till sale, and then what your role is going to be post-close, because they're going to be hesitant about you staying on and working without compensation.
Makes sense.
Because that's going to get old. That's going to get, after some point, you're going to forget about that $10 million that you put in the bank account. You're going to be like, why the hell am I going to work every day?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I think regardless, there is still some incentive, because isn't there some portion of the deal that is, stipulated on performance of the practice after you make the sale? And how does that work? Does that come into play with the amount of stock that you're getting? Is there more cash you're going to get in the future if the practice hits certain benchmarks? Like, how does all that play out?
So in a joint venture scenario where you have practice level equity, naturally you're incentivized, right? Your EBITDA distributions are predicated upon the ongoing performance of the practice, and your proceeds at recap are predicated upon the EBITDA of the practice at recap. We typically try to negotiate out any type of like holdbacks, clawbacks, seller notes, things of that nature. But with the capital markets changing, with interest rates rising, you're starting to see those things start to come back into deals in some form or fashion. I think you need to be prepared for the fact that there's likely going to be some type of penalty if the practice moves backwards substantially post-sale, whether that's some type of equity dilution clause, whether that's, some type of holdback or earnout that you're trying to get to that's predicated upon, post-sale practice performance. We also do, though, try to negotiate some type of earn up, is what we call it, where if the practice hits certain benchmarks, growth benchmarks, you're going to have additional cash payouts post-sale. Now, again, in the joint venture model, that's kind of naturally built into it. But in a holding company model, that's a good way to align incentives that if the practice grows, you're going to see additional payouts post-sale predicated upon you hitting those benchmarks.
Awesome. Well, Brandon, we got to wrap this up here, but I just want to say this has been a very awesome conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to us and talk for all of our listeners. Again, this is not something that many of our listeners have gotten a lot of information about, and I think it is, even if you don't have a group practice right now, even if you're not thinking about multi-location, you never know how things may change. And I think it's good for you to be aware of all the different scenarios out there. So, thanks again for listening, guys. Thank you for coming on, Brandon. This has been another episode of Dental Unfiltered. For all of our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, Matt and I do put a lot of effort into this. We don't have any sponsors. We appreciate the follows. We appreciate the reviews. We appreciate, you sharing the podcast with other dentists out there. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks, Brian. Yep, you too.